I'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Amanda Herzog, and I have started hosting these LinkedIn Live audio events to basically bring awareness about what it's like to live in Sweden if you're an international, especially if you're an international professional. And I'm also the founder of a company called Intertalents in Sweden. And what I do is I create educational content, and I also provide coaching services for international professionals who want to learn more about adapting to Swedish professional culture. So if you're interested in that, you can check out the link that I included in the details section of the event. And I just want to give everyone a really quick run through of how the event works. But essentially, this entire event will be in English, and it's like a podcast, a casual podcast style event. So feel free to come in and join when you wish. You can leave whenever you want. This will be recorded, and usually I put it up on the Intertalents in Sweden YouTube channel within a week of the event. So you can check there if you miss it or can't make it for the whole event. We also open up the floor for questions, usually in the second half of this event. So if you want to ask a question, you can use a tool function to raise your hand, and it puts you in the queue in chronological order. So definitely try to join that as early as possible, and you'll be in the queue. We'll just go through it one at a time, and we'll add you manually into the speaker box when it's time to ask a question. And we also ask that the questions are mainly related to the topics that we're discussing today. If you have any other kinds of questions, you're definitely welcome to send me like a private message on LinkedIn. I try to get back to people. But yes, let's go ahead and get started with the main event. So today I will be basically not even really interviewing, but let's say having an open discussion with Abel. And really, I'm going to be taking more of a listener route here as well, because I think he has a lot of interesting information that I could learn. He's an American who's also a naturalized Swedish citizen, and he's been living and working in Sweden for over a decade, or about a decade. He has over 7 years of experience in HR, particularly with companies while living in Sweden, and he focuses mainly on improving company culture and inclusive policies with Swedish organizations. So he has a lot to share with us from the inside, from the other side of these organizations. So why don't you go ahead and jump in and introduce yourself, and let's just get right to the interesting stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, I think your introduction and summary of me pretty much nailed it on the head there. Like you said, I've been in Sweden for 10 years. I'm married to a Swede. I'm thoroughly Swedish at this point. And I'm a consultant, and I work with companies both for working on their company culture, so doing codes of conduct, onboarding training, things like that, but also sustainability policies. My background is a little bit non-traditional. I went to 3 different universities on 3 different continents over a period of 9 years. I never graduated, but throughout those 9 years, the kind of the red thread was studying culture, linguistics, philosophy, and by living in those 3 different continents in those 3 different areas, I sort of I got a little trick for kind of how to learn about a culture and how to fit in and how to understand the expectations of you as you are in that culture and you live there. Yes, that's a bit about me. Should I just get going?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. And I want to hear your story about how you became what you call a Swedenologist. I think that's like so interesting of a term.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just give a little bit of a intro there, a bit about that. When I moved somewhere, because I'm so culture focused and culture obsessed, it's not enough for me just to kind of live. Like, I want to learn the language. I want to know everything about it. And when I first moved to Sweden, I'll admit I really literally thought that I was going to come for a year and probably move somewhere else afterwards, because I had been spending the last 10 years in Hawaii, and before that I was in Taiwan, so I was very used to like hot island life, and Sweden is quite the opposite of that. But then I met somebody, and now we're adopting a kid, and I'm married, so I'm firmly planted here. But the kind of way that I came around becoming a Swedenologist, as I call it, is like a typical sort of process I've done in other places where I've lived. And I thought to share just a few of those methods, the sort of processes with everybody first, so that you all can maybe try some of those for yourselves, so you can learn more about Sweden or wherever you move next. So I think the first thing that I did when I moved to Sweden was I knew nobody. I was completely alone, and I was living in Stockholm, and I made a list of every single museum in the entire city on my phone. And every weekend,
Same.
I would try to go to one, but I usually went to two. Sorry?
I said same. I also made a list of all the museums and visited them in the first like 3 months.
I mean, it's not just like to pass time, but it was really useful. And so like specifically in Stockholm, my favorite one to recommend to people who are new to Sweden is Nordiska Museet, which the name would make you think it's about the Nordics, but there's some story around how it was supposed to be about the Nordics, but then the funding got cut, and so now it's only about Sweden, even though it's called like the Nordic Museum. That one is brilliant. It goes through, like, you start at the top floor and you work your way down, and it takes you through culture and history, and it's a great crash course. I don't have enough words to describe how much I don't like Vasa Museet. I think paying that much money to go see a giant ship that sank because of a greedy king kind of rubs me the wrong way. But museums are a wonderful way to sort of get a little bit of a crash course in history and culture. Another one that I really love is Reddit. So Reddit is kind of like the opposite of Facebook. In Facebook, it's like you have all these friends and like you're seeing lots of random stuff. In Reddit, it's basically strangers, but each like subreddit, as they're called, is themed around an interest. And so Reddit says that you're exploring common interests with strangers. And there's a subreddit for everything. So one of the first things I did was I subscribed to every single subreddit I could find related to Sweden or Scandinavia or Nordic or anything like that. And it's really good for seeing like the zeitgeist, the sort of like the pulse of what's happening. You learn about how different regions of Sweden make fun of each other. You learn about how Sweden makes fun of Denmark and how Norway makes fun. Like you learn about all these little inside jokes that if you grew up here, you would just kind of have that all automatically. And being like a passive observer scrolling through Reddit, you really get sort of like an idea for what's out there. So I think Reddit is a wonderful, wonderful place to learn about these things. Another tip is TV shows. And there are two TV shows that I highly recommend. One is called Historieätarna. It's not on air. I think there was 2 or 3 seasons, but that was like maybe 7 or 8 years ago. You can find it on YouTube. And the show is basically 2 comedians. And each episode, they pick a different time period in Sweden. And for 1 week, those 2 comedians have to dress, eat, and live like they did in that time period. And they don't just do, they do different socioeconomic classes and everything. And it's everything from 100 years ago, 200 years ago to the 80s. There was an episode about the 1970s and there's an episode about the 80s. So they dress like they're in the 80s and they only eat food from the 80s. And watching that show, I've seen every episode of all the seasons several times. It's such a great way to learn history, but learn about food. I think food is a really good way to learn about how a culture and a people kind of approach life in general. So that show, Historieätarna, can't recommend it enough. The other one, this is kind of silly, but Halvota hos mig is a weekly show. I think it's on TV4 or something. But each week they're in a different city in Sweden, and it's 4 different people. And each episode, there's 1 episode a night for 4 nights. And each episode, the 3 people will go to the 4th person's house, and they take turn going to each other's houses. And on each episode, the person who's hosting at the house, they make dinner. And I love this show because it's simple Swedish, usually it's conversational. You get exposure to different accents, you get exposure to different regions of Sweden, and you get to see a lot about how people cook and how they talk about food, which again, I think that's a really good way to learn about a culture in general. So like I've got to limit myself. Okay, so keep going. Historical documentaries can be a little bit boring, but I think they're really good. Like I feel like there's one from the 70s called Utvandra, which is like the immigrants. Really hard to get through. It's really long, but I feel like that's a required watch for anyone new to Sweden. It's the story of a family who moves from Sweden to Minnesota in the US. And they've recently, I think, redone that like a few years ago or something. But watching things like that are really, really good. There's a documentary called The Swedish Theory of Love that is amazing. It was made by an Italian director, and it starts with how in the 70s, Sweden essentially got rid of marriage. The prime minister at the time said that marriage is holding women back from progressing in society, and so we need to change the relationship between people and the government. And from that point on, that was like a tipping point in Swedish culture and Swedish life. And the documentary tracks like how that played out across from the 70s until now. Really, really amazing. It has a bit of a shocking end to it. And I've watched it with Swedish friends who are all like, this is so cool. And then it gets to the end and you're like, what? So I'm going to leave that as a cliffhanger. Definitely watch that one, The Swedish Theory of Love.
Can I just say I'm seeing a few thumbs up here from some women as you're talking about this. Yes, I think maybe they agree with some of this. Yeah, I see a heart.
That's a really, really good one.
If you're into this, just leave like a little emoji so Abel can see it.
Thank you. I love that. I think philosophical and cultural like writing is not really for everyone, but it's really, really valuable. There's a book that's in Swedish called Är svenskan människa, which means is the Swede human? It is tremendous. It is an amazing book that really does just a perfect job of like encapsulating like what is Swedishness. They've recently done a translation into English, and it's called The Swedish Theory of Love. It's completely not connected to the documentary. They just happen to have that same name because that's a big part of the book. But really, really good to read philosophy and like cultural writing. Another one that I think is really good for learning about culture is studying how the government works. I'll be very honest that for the first few years I lived here, like I didn't really think I was going to stay actually, so I wasn't really that invested in the government. But when the pandemic happened and I was watching how the Swedish government was handling it compared to literally everywhere else in the world, and I was reading a lot of international news coverage of how Sweden was handling it, I became just completely obsessed with our government. And I read everything I could find about it, how the government was formed, how the different ministries interact with each other. And then I went into like all the different political parties, like where did they come from? Like what kind of people tend to support them? And it was through understanding how the government works and like what citizens expect of the government that I had this like huge epiphany about how culture works in general. So that's really good. And language, I mean, obviously learning Swedish is very good, like do that, don't delay on that. But I think the side effect of learning language that's really nice is learning expressions. Mm-hmm. So I really love learning funny expressions. Like there's one that I learned that's used in Värmland that's ingen ko på isen. So there's no cows on the ice. And I learned that in Värmland, and then I used that in my office in Stockholm. And literally everyone just like, it was like a record scratch, and everyone stared at me and they're like, what? And I was like, there's no danger. There's no cows on the ice. And they're like, that's not an expression. And I was like, yeah, it is. And so we Googled it, and that became this whole discussion about how there's really interesting, like, specific sayings and phrases all over the country. And learning these different expressions from different regions of the country really helps you understand the people in those different regions. And the fact that many of them don't know each other's expressions also kind of sheds a light about how these different populations within the country interact with one another. And I think the last thing I'll say here, because I want to get going to the next topic, is there's this thing that I call salient details. I don't really know of like another term for it, but salient details to me is that, like, so for example, if I were to teach English to somebody, and they were to say like, well, why is that wrong? Or like, why do you say it that way? Or like, why is it this way? Like, a lot of the times I won't know. I'll be like, oh, I don't know, it just sounds better that way or something. So a lot of the way that a culture is defined is these internal rules that we just know, that we learn, and that we never really understand why it is that certain way. And so like the salient detail, like that title, it's like, to the outsider, you don't know which details are important and which details are just like flourishes, you know? So like if I was teaching someone to write, like a Chinese person to write in English, I might handwrite something and say, hey, copy this. And then they're going to try to copy every letter exactly as I wrote it. But like, you know, they don't know what the important part of like writing the letter I is. Like maybe that dot on the top is just my pen accidentally made a dot or something. Like they don't know what's important. So how this works is like, well, I'll be in some sort of interaction, and like I'll see something, and I'll be like, hey, like why did you say it that way? Or like, why is this that way? And very often it's like they just turn to a question mark. They're like, huh, I don't know. I never thought about that. And then we'll have a discussion around, you know, that thing. Or sometimes they're just like, oh no, that's just me. I just randomly do it that way or whatever. So it's this process of like asking honest, open questions to figure out like which details are actually meaningful and which details are just that person or just an accident or something.
And
I think
yeah, I just want to add a quick note to that. I think that's also a really good strategy to make friends with Swedish people, to integrate yourself, because something that I learned in the first year that I was in Sweden is I did something kind of similar. Like, why is it so important during Cantaradler season to not show like your secret spot to find the mushrooms and things like that? And I ended up getting invited with a Swedish family to their secret spot, actually, which I forgot where it's at. But I think it's a really good strategy to have them like kind of warm up to you, because I think everyone sort of likes teaching others about their own culture, not just Sweden, but any culture. So it's a really great idea to just say, why do you do this? Like, how do you say this? Or why is it that way?
Yeah, I mean, and being like just like very just like childlike and just open and non-judgmental and just asking. Like that's it's a simple way to go about it, but it's really, really powerful. I think the last thing I'll say on this is I do have a secret weapon. Both my sister-in-law and my father-in-law are teachers, and they have degrees in Swedish language and Swedish history. And my father-in-law's favorite thing to do is to practice his English by having very deep philosophical conversations with me. So I've learned a lot about Sweden by having some beers with him in a sauna, and then just like talking about the philosophy of Sweden and things like that. So some of this is my little secret weapon that I've gotten along the way.
Big time. And
so that's...
Yeah, I just want to say, I think some of these things that you mentioned, like some of the resources, you did recently make a post on LinkedIn, I think it was this week, where you include some of like the books that you're referencing to. But I think these are really great unconventional resources, and I mean, maybe it would be a cool idea if you could somehow compile them into maybe like a short little LinkedIn post, or I know you're into sharing this. I mean, if you guys in the audience think that it would be interesting or useful to have access to this, can you just like leave some kind of emoji? Because I wish I would have had, just even knowing about the Reddit groups in Sweden. Yeah, I see a couple thumbs up, so maybe you might want to like continue on with your resources, but you already have a post that you made just this week with actual pictures of the books and the names and the titles. So you guys can definitely like just go over to his profile and look at his recent posts to find some of them there already.
Yeah, please, like just add me, follow me, whatever. I know my profile says follow, but if you click add, I'll definitely add you back. But I'm in a space right now where I'm doing a lot more content about this. So I'm going to add that to my list to do something very like Swedish culture specific for sure. That's great.
Now, can we start heading
all right
further down in the direction towards like the really like heavy hitting? I know we're like leading our way there. So go ahead and take us into the next topic.
Yes. So what I've prepared a little bit of a plan today. So I've chosen 4 big topics that I've experienced, at least in my opinion, that I think that are very big, or at least for me, were very like eye-opening about Swedish culture and specifically about working in Sweden. So I'm gonna go through each. I'm gonna go through these 4 big topics. But before I do that, I really want to be extremely clear that it's difficult to talk about culture, because there is this line between a generalization and a stereotype. And today, everything that I'm talking about is a generalization. So generalizations they're informed, they're broad, they're descriptions of a culture, of a community. And they're based in history, geography, and pointable sources. And the really important part about a generalization is that it's not saying everyone in that community is that. There's nothing about generalization that's like, this is genetic to Swedish people, or like, because you grew up in Sweden, you must be this way. That would be a stereotype. Stereotypes are broad, they're very specific. I mean, they sort of imply this like genetic inherentness. And stereotypes, like it's like everyone is that way. Stereotypes are harmful, they're hurtful, they're not. There's no place for them. And many stereotypes kind of grow out of a generalization and then are used in a hurtful way. But that's not what we're doing today. Like, we're only doing generalization. So I'll come back to this several times as I'm talking. But I just want to be super clear that when I talk about Swedes and Swedish people and Swedish culture, I'm by no way saying that every Swede is this way, or if you grew up here, then you must be this way. Just so that's clear. Okay. So I think the first one that I'm going to talk about is something that like blew my mind when I learned about this. And it's called Jantelagen, or which is like the law of Jante, or the law of Jante, however you want to say it. And it came about in the 1930s in Denmark. There was this fiction book written by a Danish guy, Axel Sender Mose, I think his name is. And it's called A Fugitive Crosses His Tracks. And this fictional book had this code of ethics in it. It was like a code of conduct, essentially. And he wrote it as a criticism. Like, it was supposed to be like making fun of Nordic culture. Like, he was doing it in like a negative reaction to what he saw in Nordic culture. And the code of conduct says things like, you're not to think you are anything special. You are not to think you're as good as we are. You're not to think you're smarter than we are. You're not to imagine yourself better than we are. You're not to laugh at us. It's very much about making sure that everyone is like equal and kind of like oppressing people in a way. And for some reason, this just like caught on, and it backfired in the opposite direction of what he had written it for. And it became this sort of like agreed upon code of conduct for many people across the Nordic countries. And that's, I mean, a lot of people point to this as like the foundation of what we think about as like egalitarian, Nordic culture. And what's happening now, and I sort of observed this, and then I started asking some Swedish friends about it, and they helped me understand it better. I was like, I learned about Jantelagen, and I was like, but I don't really see this. Like, I don't really see, like how can we have ABBA and Spotify and Klarna, and how can we be like such an extreme country, but still have this like unwritten, code of conduct? And I learned that like 40 years ago, there was a backlash, and there's the anti-Jantelagen, which is the opposite of it. So it's like, you should believe you are somebody. You should believe that you are smarter than some people. And I've learned from my Swedish friends that in school, in grade school, they were literally taught the anti-Jantelagen. Like, they were told, like, don't follow Jantelagen. And that's how I see Swedish culture today, as the last 40 years, it's been going through this cultural revolution. And it has nothing to do with the immigrants, like some politicians might say. Sweden is going through their own cultural revolution because you had this sort of foundation where a lot of the government and a lot of the kind of footwork for what became today was based in this Jantelagen. But then in the 80s sometime, it switched, and Swedes were told to be proud, and they were told to be something special. And that's kind of ties in this other aspect where I feel like Sweden is a little bit a culture of contradictions. Like, one of the first funny words I learned in Swedish that like has no translation is lagom. And for those who don't know, like, lagom means like not too much, not too little. So like, you might be at a bar and like someone's like, should we get another round? And you'll be like, no, this was lagom. Like, you want to stay middle road. And a lot of the older generation Swedes I've spoken to, and just a lot of Swedes in general, they see Sweden as being a very lagom country. We're not extreme in any way. But that's completely not true. like when you compare Sweden to the rest of the world, Sweden is nothing but lagom. It is only extremes. Like last year, 2023, it was estimated that up to 84% of Swedish people are atheist. That's the highest number of any country in the entire world. The Sweden is the third largest contributor to pop music after the United States and the UK. Like, the entire population of Sweden is smaller than the population of Los Angeles. So Sweden is so spectacular. Last year we got ranked by US News as the the highest quality of life. It's like all over. You look at all these international comparisons, and Sweden is anything but middle road. And so I feel like there's this contradiction within Swedish mindsets today about, like, are we lagom? Are we spectacular? And I think this goes back to Jantelagen.
Can I just add like that emoji with like the brain kind of exploding emoji? Because yeah, that's a really good insight. I don't know what else to say other than I'm learning with everyone else listening. But continue. It's fascinating.
I really encourage everyone to just go Google for Jantelagen and Google for anti-Jantelagen and just read about the history of those two things. From what the conversations I've had, there's like, I think the kind of senior citizens and the older population, they still very firmly hold true to Jantelagen, but the younger generations are very against it. Like, I've worked for, I think, 5 different companies in Sweden. All of them were founded by Swedish men. And I've had conversations with them where I've asked them about Jantelagen, and I was like, what is it like to like start a business and, still have Jantelagen in your head? And all of them are like, no one believes that. That's stupid, blah, 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 blah. But then, like, I still feel it sometimes. So, Amanda, I wanted to talk to you about how you see this sort of duality of Jantelagen and anti-Jantelagen playing out when you're applying for jobs, when you're working in a company, and when you're working through like a performance evaluation or something. Have you had any experience with that, or is this ringing true to anything for you?
I mean, I definitely need to ponder on that, because I'm still pondering on just the concept that you have of Jantelagen. It exists, the theory and the idea. I think most people, when they first move to Sweden, they start going on Google and Googling, which, side note, isn't it funny that the word Googling is now like a verb? But you go on Google and you look, what is Sweden? And one of the very like common generic things you learn is Jantelagen. And you bring up some really valid points, which I think could go into such a deeper discussion. Like it could go on like just only on this topic. We have many to cover today. But the idea here is that we're told that it exists. And so we kind of try to apply that, maybe even with our job searching. I think a good example is I try to teach people, how do you present yourself in a job interview where you're a little bit lagon, like you still have to advertise yourself as capable and qualified for the job, but you need to be somewhat humble. You don't want to go so far as to be like how I did, the American style, where when you're interviewing, you're really selling yourself. Yeah. And so, and I will say, on the one hand, that has been quite beneficial, but then you meet certain Swedish organizations or hiring managers where I think I might have even discussed it during the regatta event, where they actually, it was one of my previous managers was Swedish, but he had worked for an American company for, I don't know, maybe a decade. So he wasn't quite so, Jante, if you want to, Jantelagen. So I didn't know that going in, but I quickly kind of figured it out and adjusted. So I think, things are changing. Like if companies and Swedish organizations remain Jantelagen completely, they won't be the third largest producer of pop music, for example, or you won't have IKEA and things like that. Yeah. So I think people can get very confused attempting to be Jantelagen, and then maybe they get like an outcome they weren't expecting when they meet someone who's anti-Jantelagen. So you've given us a lot, including me, to really think about. Like, this is just the rabbit hole, and we're like staring into it. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things I learned at my first job in Sweden was kind of like this Swedish mannerism of how they'll reject you. So like you'll be in a brainstorming session and like, everyone's like pitching ideas and stuff. And this went way over my head, but like I had said this idea and someone, a Swedish person was like, yeah, that's an idea. And I froze. I was like, what? Like, yeah, it is an idea. That's why I said it. And then afterwards, like after it was over, I was talking to them. I was like, what did you mean when you said that? And they're like, well, like, you don't want to be rude. You don't want to say it's a bad idea. So you just confirm that they said something, basically.
That's quite funny.
And I feel like that sort of interplay between having maybe like parents and grandparents of the Jantelagen generation, but they're being raised in a school system where they're telling to be anti-Jantelagen, they both exist in their brains at the same time. And so there's this really weird balance of like, when do you kind of show yourself? When do you talk really proudly about yourself? And like, when do you pull that back? So I think, like you said, like in my early years in Sweden, I was definitely labeled as being like a very American and like very loud and like speaking too proudly of myself. And actually, I worked on an ad campaign, and I didn't think it was like especially boastful or especially proud. But like the reaction was like, no, we cannot say this. Like you cannot talk about yourself that strongly. Like that's just weird. Like no one would do. So yes, I think to sum this up, like there's this culture of contradictions, and I think it goes back to this generational divide between these two views of life. So when you're going through like applying for a job, when you're working in a company, a brainstorming session, or when you're going through a performance evaluation, it's a very tricky balance to figure out like the amount that you can be boastful and the amount that you need to pull it back and be humble. Which is very different for the U.S. culture. I can't really speak to any other cultures, though.
I totally agree.
All right. So we started off very heavy.
Yeah. We're doing great. Let's keep going. I love these topics.
All right, so this next one is something that I find really, really fascinating. And I think a lot of these things go back to Intertalents, but I'm going to stop talking about that now. What I want to talk about now is flat organizations versus hierarchical. I can never say that word. Whatever. Opposite of flat organization. And how those two formats of organization connect to the idea of a consensus culture. So in Sweden, and this has been many jobs that I've had, where it's talked about as having a flat organization. Like, we're a flat organization. Sometimes there's a phrase that's used, högt i tak, which means high in ceilings. And it's a phrase that kind of means everyone's viewpoints are accepted. Like, it's a high ceiling, so everyone's short. Or I don't really know what it means, but that expression just means that like everyone can share what's on their mind. I've also been advised that that phrase got kind of hijacked by some people in the 90s, and so it has a bad taste in some people's mouths, but that's the origin of the phrase. And so a lot of companies I've worked at kind of pride themselves on being flat. And I think a lot of when Sweden's exported, that's one of the things that they pride themselves on is all the advantages of a flat organization. You know, information is, you know, unlimited. Everyone has access to it. Decisions are made in a consensus manner. So in a consensus manner, meaning everyone involved is talking about it, and it's not a matter of convincing that one person convincing everybody else, but it's everyone together deciding this is what we want as a group and going forward. Flat organizations have a lot of, you know, self-leadership, and there's a lot of independence that comes with it. It's like with feedback, for example, like we'll go into feedback later, but like with feedback in the flat organization, like it's good, but it's not like super necessary. And the problem is that like Sweden is once again a major outlier in this. If you like compare to other countries, like if you think about Sweden, the sort of diagram is a circle, and everyone on the team is in that circle. Everyone in the company on the team is in that circle. And equal placed in that circle is like a leader or a manager or a boss. And they don't necessarily have more power or anything. They're sort of like a facilitator or something like that. But that leader can't just decide and say, all of you are wrong. Like, you know, we're doing it my way. Like that would be very anti-Swedish. And when you compare it to other countries, like I really don't know of any other country that has that system. If you look at Denmark or Norway or the UK, they have something similar where there is sort of like a round visual of people sitting in a circle and sort of discussing things. But there is a boss or a manager or a leader outside of that circle who does or can have like a final say, and they can sort of dominate. And I think those are somewhat similar, but a little bit different. And then you compare that to like the US or, you know, Latin America, South America, Central America, or like the Middle East, where it's very much like a hierarchy, where you have this one person at the top and they have a few people that report to them. And then those people in turn have people that report to them. And there's like this tree that goes down. And there's other systems like it's common like in a lot of Asian countries where you'll have that same kind of round vision of the team, but there'll be like a few people who are the leaders who like confer along with everybody else. And this is really difficult because if you're used to a hierarchy and then you come to Sweden, you're going to feel like your manager is lazy or like is not an expert. Like when you work in a hierarchical structure, you look to your boss as sort of the expert, as the one with the answers. So if you don't know what to do, you go ask them. Or if you're used to a hierarchy, you're expecting your leader to help you or tell you what to do. There's this really famous story of Volvo opening up a factory in India and sending a bunch of Swedish managers over there. And a few months later, all the Indian employees were like, these Swedish managers are pointless. They just sit around doing nothing all day. Like we don't know what to do. They don't tell us what to do. We have no idea what's going on. And all the Swedish managers were apparently like moved back to Sweden or something. And it's just like a cultural misunderstanding. The Swedish leaders thought that they were being very respectful by allowing the team to decide themselves what to do and how to do things, whereas the Indian employees saw their managers as being lazy for not telling them what to do. So I think that there's a good lesson here for both Swedes and international people working in Sweden about flat organizations have many great positives, and it's wonderful. But hierarchies also have some benefits to them, and you need to understand both. So if you're working in a Swedish company that's very traditional and has this flat organization, you really need to know that you need to be volunteering information. You need to be saying, hey, I want to do this. I think we should do it this way. And I've seen that a lot in previous jobs where we've had people move to Sweden to work at the company, and back in their home country, they're like mega rock star famous. And then they come to Sweden, and after a few months, their boss is like, yeah, I really regret hiring this person. They don't do anything. I don't understand. And it's because there's this expectation mix match between what's expected of them. So, Amanda, is any of this sounding familiar, or have you experienced it at all?
Yeah, I had a thought in particular when you were talking about this, and without completely like derailing this into another topic, I was thinking about bureaucracy in Sweden, because something that I hear a lot from people who move here from another country where the hierarchy system, like let's say in the US, I grew up with a mother who was in the military. So when we talk about hierarchy, I was taught from a young age the chain of command. Like you wait for your boss, and then they have to go to that boss, and so on. And that's the mindset that I had. And then when I came to Sweden, and I got a job at, I believe you could say my first real job out of in Swedish society was at Husqvarna, and they have for the most part like quite a flat organization. Like managers are approachable, and I was really enjoying the more relaxed sort of way of operating internally as an employee. But then when you're someone who's external, and let's say you need to deal with like a bureaucratic process or customer service, it's the same thing like you say, like it can that you were mentioning, like you can feel that they're not very proactive, or things move quite slowly in a way because you have to go through the process of elimination. You have to, everyone has to kind of give consensus, or, maybe no one's really taking too much initiative if someone else is expecting that. So I think if you're a foreigner who's moving to Sweden, you really need to understand this concept and talk to the hiring manager, maybe even ask about it in an interview to make sure that, are you showing up in this interview in a way that, like, do you have the right expectations? Are you coming from a country where you know that you have to respect authority, basically, and speak to your manager first and just basically complete the tasks that they give you? Or is this organization expecting you to be very self-sufficient, independent? What are they expecting in that interview? And I would lean more in the direction of a flat organization where they expect you to be kind of like almost like your own boss, and you just check in with the boss above you.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing. I mean, one thing that I've advised a lot of people when it comes to performance reviews, I think this is probably generally true like anywhere, but I only started doing it when I moved to Sweden. Is I keep a little list of like things that I'm doing and things that I've initiated and things that I've started. And when it comes to a performance review, like I'm like, I have this list ready to say like look, these are the things that I brought, because that's kind of the expectation around a flat organization, is that you, like you said, you're kind of your own boss in a way. Like you need to be bringing things to the table. And it's not to say that your leader is not there to help you. Like, of course, I mean, that's what they're there for. But I think it's very often seen as rude of a leader to tell someone what to do or to tell them how to do it. Mm. Okay, So let's go on to the third topic here. So this one is another kind of deep one, I think. And it's this concept. It's called statist individualism, or it's kind of like radical individualism. And I think this is another one of these like culture of contradictions, like I was saying before, where from the outside, like before I moved to Sweden, I thought of Sweden and the Nordics in general kind of like the Smurfs. Like it's like a big community and everyone's helping each other, and it's like it's all, you know, group oriented, and it's very much like individualism is bad. Like everyone should be together, and like it's like, I'm not going to say communist, but like it has like that sort of vibe to it. But then after moving here and living here, I've realized that it's really quite the opposite. And I've come to read, specifically in the book I mentioned before, Är svensken människa, like is the Swede human, that's where this term status individualism comes from. They argue that Sweden may be the only culture, the only country that has this structure. And the way that they talk about it is they have a triangle, and there's 3 points to the triangle. And so on one point, you have government. Another point, you have individual. And then on the third point, you have family. And in the book, they talk about how Germans, they live on the line between government and family. So the way that the government is set up in terms of taxes and support and all those things, they're there to foster families, and they want people to build families, and like that's the relationship to the government is the family to the government. And then they say that in the US American culture, it lives on the points between individual and family. So in the US, it's very common that if you want to go to college, your parents co-sign a loan for you to go to college. So there's a lot of depending on your family in order to succeed and to survive in society. And then they say in Sweden, the Swedish culture lives on the line in between individual and government. And I think that this goes back to this marriage being dissolved in the 70s, where they reorganized the way that the government is set up so that the relationship between the citizen is directly to the government. And so an individual should not have to rely on their family or their friends or anyone else in order to survive. They should be able to do it for themselves. A sort of like random side story about how I discovered this was my partner and I were going on a trip with my sister-in-law and her boyfriend, and they were still in school. And I was like, well, we can pay for their hotel room. And my partner just like looked at me like I had 4 heads. I was like, what? And I was like, but they're in school. Like they don't have a lot of money. Like we have good salaries. Like let's pay for their hotel room. And my partner was just like, that is so strange. Why would you do that? And I was like, can we just ask her? And then we asked her, and she just like froze and stared at me. She's like, do you think that we're not able to do this? And that sort of spawned this conversation around like really like radical individualism in Sweden. And I think that this interplays in the work culture as well, where we have like again, back to this like flat system, where it's like you said before, it's kind of like you're expected almost to be your own boss in a way. Have you experienced anything like this?
You mean in terms of being your own boss in the workplace? Like
this like radical individualism that's in Sweden, where it's like you shouldn't be asking your family for help or something, or your friends for help. Like you should do it for yourself, and if you need help, then you ask the government for help.
You know, I mean, personally, you know, I'm an American just like you as well. So we sort of have that background sort of ingrained into us. But something that I learned when I was also researching Swedish culture, similarly to the way that you have, even though you've gone really deep into the facts in the books, But something that I learned is individualism, the way it kind of came about is because the government, as you said, started promoting individualism. That's why they created these social welfare systems so that you can basically be an individualist and not have to completely rely on other people, which, you know, has its pros and the cons. But I remember somebody mentioning a very interesting observation, which is if you look at the elderly people here, a lot of them are walking around with walkers and canes, and yes, they might be moving a bit slowly, but they're out there and they're moving. They're not like completely just depending on other people, or even in wheelchairs. It's almost like they have this mentality of I want to keep my autonomy. I want to keep myself going and taking care of myself as long as I can. And I think really overall it's a mindset of the culture in general. And I think it also, you know, can come into the workplace, especially with when it comes to management. The Swedish culture has found this really unique way of you know, the way that they manage people, which is, yeah, we're going to keep this idea of individualism. And this is why I try to teach to other people. You really need to learn about Swedish culture. Like, spend less time working on your CV and your LinkedIn, which are important. But if you've worked on your CV and your LinkedIn, you know that you're qualified and you're still not getting the job. Have you looked into understanding the cultural aspect? Because the tiniest little nuance and the fact that you might know that in your next interview that your hiring manager might want you to be more of like an independent worker could totally change the way that you answer their questions. Even with the same experience. Now you know like that you need to let them know like, oh, I did this project with minimal resources or support from other people versus, you know, maybe they want to know if you could follow orders from upper management. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. But the cultural aspect is huge in the workplace.
Yeah. And I think this, like, so I chose like the order of these topics. I think they keep on looping back into the other ones. So you have like this consensus culture, I think, is tied into this about, yes, we are individuals and we will rely on ourselves or on the government in order to succeed. But at the same time, like, we don't want our choices to be affecting other people. And so like we have this consensus driven process for ensuring that everyone is agreeing that this is the thing we're going to do. Yeah.
Now,
okay.
I know we have one more topic, which I think is a super fascinating one. And then after that, we're going to open up the floor for Q&A. So now is the time to start joining the queue, and we'll be getting to that in a few minutes. But should we?
Yeah, I saw one person raise their hand for a second there.
Yeah, feel free to get into the queue because we'll still see it later when it's time.
Yeah, so the last one isn't so much, I think, profound as maybe like status individualism or Jantelagin, but I think it's a really subtle thing to understand, which is it comes to like feedback and conflict at work or in social situations. In two companies I worked at in Sweden, while in their HR teams, I was asked by like the senior leadership to help build a culture of feedback. And I worked at Apple for 5 years, a long time ago, and I was a trainer there. And so one of my things, I basically just traveled around to different Apple stores, training Apple employees on how to be Apple employees. And I very shamelessly just stole everything that Apple did, but Apple does it all the time anyway, so I don't feel bad about it. But like Apple had this thing called fearless feedback, and they had this whole process for how to ask for feedback, how to give feedback, and how to do it in a way that's open and like it just feels nice to do. And so I've tried to bring that to two different companies in Sweden. And again, I did it because like my Swedish senior leadership team asked me to do this. And in both situations, I found it very interesting that it was primarily Swedish people that were really uncomfortable with it. Like I remember very specifically, one Swedish person came to me and said, like, this is so inappropriate. It's my manager's job to tell my coworkers how they're doing. if I have a problem with a coworker, or if I think that their work is not good or something like that, it's my responsibility to tell their manager and for their manager to have that conversation with them. And they really just like were very uncomfortable with the idea of having these like open conversations of saying like this wasn't good or that was really good or something. And in those same companies, as a comparison, I had someone from the Netherlands who absolutely loved it and was like, "Oh, this is so great! This is like just a really clear formula for how to go about doing this." And I had American people and South Americans also kind of react the same way, where like they really wanted to give feedback, but they were unsure how to go about it, and they felt really good about it. But I had this maybe general to minor, I'll say, maybe more minor reaction from many Swedes, that it just felt very inappropriate to go about it in that way. And again, I think this goes back to this like duality of the Jantelagin and the anti-Jantelagin about like, who am I to say that, you're not doing a good job? I think it also ties back into this like this radical individualism about not staying in your lane, sort of. But I also think that it kind of contradicts the idea of a flat organization. Like in a flat organization, like I said before, like it's typically that feedback is good, but it's not necessarily like the end all be all. But in a hierarchical organization, like feedback is how you do things. So I've had a lot of like cultural conflict with trying to get feedback kind of built into the everyday culture of a company. So when it comes to maybe not so much recruitment or applying for jobs, but when it comes to like working in a Swedish company or going through sort of a performance evaluation, I find this personally really tricky, because I love feedback, and I feel like I have this way that I learned at Apple, at least, where I can do it very respectfully, but I often am bumping my head trying to make it happen. So I don't really have any good advice here. It's more about just kind of sharing that story of how there seems to be maybe a international influence for it. I know that Klarna, they have something called radical candor, where they encourage everyone to be radically candor with each other. But just in general, I've found this topic to be very touchy for many places I've worked at in Sweden. Have you had any experience with that?
When you were talking about it, the same word came to my mind, which is tricky. It's a very tricky topic because I think this is something that's just sort of ingrained into Swedish culture, where they're very conflict adverse. And I actually teach about this in my networking course. It's a framework that I created called the Spectrum of Comfort. But the idea is that you use the tool from Hofstede Insights to see the actual comparison of each country and culture around the world, and they give them a number score. And you can see where Sweden falls on, I don't believe that it's directly labeled conflict adversity, but how do they react to familiarity and unfamiliarity? And I believe that Sweden is not very high on the scale of being flexible when it comes to dealing with unfamiliar situations. And I sort of came up with a method. I think you said you don't have advice. I have like some version of advice for this. So I gave a presentation a few months ago. If anyone's curious about it, I do sell this presentation, or it's also offered in my networking course. It's just part of the course. But if you just want the presentation, I believe it's like 100 crown or something. So feel free to send me a message. Or I think you can find it on the website as well, Intertalents in Sweden. But basically what I teach is that you cannot just go in directly for the ask when it comes to Swedish culture, or with majority of Swedish people. And again, we're not this is like a generalization. We're
generalizing.
Yeah. We're generalizing. This doesn't apply to every single person. But if you want to play it safe, I came up with a framework where essentially what you do is, especially if you come from a culture where it's common to just be direct. Like in America, you could be in the line at the grocery store and talk to the stranger next to you and say, "Oh man, look at this magazine cover. Look at this crazy headline." And they'll kind of laugh and they'll be okay with that. But I think in Sweden, you'll kind of get a weird look. So I do have this method that I created, and it sort of looks a little bit like a bullseye symbol, or maybe like if you think of darts, if you go to like a sports bar and you sort of start on the outside and you work your way in. So I don't know if maybe these like feedback systems that you were taught are similar, but I teach people, and I kind of use the method myself, where you start soft, you kind of feel out their reaction, you see if it's safe to go in a little bit more, and usually it's like 3 or 4 layers in before you can actually ask, like, "Hey, do you want to have a fika?" Or, "Hey, how do you feel about, this project that I worked on," for them to see if they actually feel comfortable enough to be direct with you. Because otherwise you might get a polite response like what you said, in terms of like, "Oh yeah, that's an idea." Yeah, that's an idea. It's like you might get "that's an idea," or you might be able to kind of soften them up to being more open about it. So that's kind of my advice there, is you can't really change like another culture. You kind of got to adapt to it, or at least try to understand it. And I think it's very tricky, for sure. The nuances.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I'm so culture focused, is that I really want to know what's expected of me, so that I am respectful and I am doing things like correctly within the given culture. I mean, we are comparing to the U.S. a lot, but I've heard a lot of Swedish people say things like Finnish and Russian people are very direct. Like if you do something wrong, it's like, "You're doing that wrong. Do this way." Or they'll say like, "That's a dumb idea." So I've heard a lot of Swedes like contrast their way of giving feedback with Finnish and Russian and maybe Eastern European culture in general.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Should we?
Those are the big topics I have.
I mean, very fascinating, all of these. I mean, I think each section we could go like deeper and deeper and deeper. But for sure, I learned a few new things today myself. I mean, you're very educated, let's say, in Swedish culture. That's why you call yourself a Swedenologist, because you've read books, you've studied, you've looked at data. It can definitely be applied to not just integrating in terms of, finding friends and things like that, but it's super important when it comes to the job market. And this is why I'm always telling people and posting online, like, Sweden is a unique place professionally. It really, I mean, even from Denmark, Norway, and Finland, there are unique things about this country in particular. But yeah, I want to go ahead and start opening things up for a Q&A. Like if anyone has a question for Abel or myself, but this is definitely the time to ask Abel some questions about, let's say, Swedish culture, or what kind of questions would you say that you are open for answering?
Anything. Let's go for it.
Well, we have...
Super interested to see what will come out of here.
Okay, we have Simon. I'm going to go ahead and add you to the speaker box. And if anyone else wants to ask Abel a question about, like, what is it like from the back end? Like, I think you've said you worked in HR, like just some of the secrets from behind the scenes and interviewing. Those are the types of things that you can ask. So go ahead and just get in the queue and we'll get to you next. All right, Simon, you're in.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you very much for this. It was really nice to hear from you about the Swedish culture. So I have a really good question. I have a friend, I know someone that he has also been introduced to the Swedish market in the Swedish company. And then he find out himself not really getting assignments or getting work to do. And then at the end, it was he ended up being laid off because of the harvest beast. So he was not able to have an assignment from his manager, and then they decided to let him off. And then, yeah, that was my question. What do you think he should have done, to not be in this situation?
It was a little bit choppy. Was it choppy for you, Amanda?
Yeah, a little bit. But what I understood is he had a friend who got either a job or a consultation, and he didn't really get any assignments from his management, and then he ended up getting let go from the company. So if I understand correctly, Simon's asking if what could he have done differently, or should he have done differently? Is this like a cultural thing or something else? Is that correct, Simon?
Exactly. Thank you.
I mean, I can say that I've experienced that firsthand as well, where you feel like you're just kind of like drifting. And you're like, well, why? I have nothing to do. I mean, I can't really speak to like their specific situation, but I would go back to the discussion before about flat versus hierarchical structures, where it's sort of expected that you will be suggesting and bringing things and like talking about things and having ideas. I think I've had a lot of success with that personally. Like in one of my positions, my role was very, very vague. Like it was like, you work with culture. And so I was constantly just like pitching ideas essentially. Or sometimes I would even start something and kind of work on it for a little bit, so it had some weight to it before I pitched it, so it was easier to catch on to. I mean, that's the best idea. That's the best advice I can give, is just to constantly be asking, or maybe not asking what to do, but like suggesting things to do. Because that's kind of what the expectation is from a flat environment, is that each person is bringing something to the table, and they're not just passively waiting for something to come to them.
Yeah. I know he even more, like he got SFE, Finnish, Swedish. He is like international, so yeah, he got SFE. He also tried a lot to introduce what he can do and contribute, even though it was like that, I don't know, more, but yeah, that's what's his situation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a cynical side of me that kind of thinks, again, I have no idea about this person, but I feel like this also could attach to this concept of the conversation we had around feedback, where it's like, it's difficult to tell someone that they're not pleased or something, and so there's just like this silence instead of promoting it. But
yeah, I can say that I agree with you, Abel. Actually, I was kind of in a somewhat similar situation when I was at Husqvarna, because I actually changed management or changed groups, and when I went from one manager to the other one didn't really give me that. It was very confusing, like, okay, well, what am I working on now? And I kind of followed the same I guess theory or pattern that you're suggesting here, which is just to ask. First I asked, like, okay, what are you expecting of me? What do you need from me? And if it wasn't clear, I mean, I'm kind of a bit more of a proactive person. So I would actually come with suggestions like, okay, well, in that case, what if I do this? What if I do that? And like, I would pitch things, and I was able to pitch some projects that were actually just agreed upon. So I think really it's just rather go through the process of trying to ask directly, or maybe not too direct if it's going to scare them, but just ask them, like, what I think in Sweden it's very common to have open-ended kind of questions, like, hey, is there anything you're expecting from me, or what would you like me to work on? And if it's still not clear, maybe make a suggestion. Well, perhaps I could do this and that. So and if that doesn't work out, then it isn't meant to be at that point. Sometimes you gotta walk away. But yeah, why don't we go
or
ahead
even like reframing it. You can even like reframe it from like, what should I be working on, to reframing it to say like what does the organization need right now? Like what are the big opportunities to work on, and then suggesting something from your skills that can apply to that.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's move to the next question. We have Renzi. You're in the box.
Hey, thanks for this. It's been very entertaining, and also, Abel, your insights have been really cool. And I would agree from the last conversation that it's difficult sometimes to know, especially coming from somewhere else, what is expected of you. And I find that if you suggest things, what about this? What about that? I mean, it's too late for Simon's friend, but if you kind of, okay, if you have any kind of information about what the company needs, step in and say, hey, I could do this. Or, you know, I have skills in that.
Exactly.
You know, stuff like that. I think it's more, because it is quite open-ended, I think the sort of suggestions can be appreciated without pushing too hard, but, you know, kind of like, oh, this is a good, maybe a fit or possibility or whatever. It always has to be a little bit like, we could do this. You can easily back out. You don't have to do it, but maybe.
Here's an idea.
Yeah, right. My question for Abel is, I think you said you started out in Stockholm and now you're in Göteborg.
Yes.
Do you find any kind of difference between the two cities in terms of approaches? I know that Swedes would say there's a huge difference, I'm sure, but what do you see? Anything?
Yeah. Okay. So I, whenever someone asks me like, what is it like? What's it been like moving to Gothenburg? I have the same story that I tell every single time. So I was a member at SOTS, like the gym chain in Stockholm.
Yeah.
I remember there for like 6 or 7 years. Went to several different locations, kind of had the same experience every time. You know, everyone's there, they're doing their thing. Like if you see your friend, you go talk to them. But like I never like made any friends at the gym. Like it was never like that.
Just super unusual for an American.
A little bit, yeah. So then my first time, literally, not even exaggerating, literally my first time going to a SOTS in Gothenburg after I moved down here. I was, you know, in the gym doing my thing, had my headphones on, mind my own business. And like out of the corner of my eye, I saw this like sort of like out of shape, like, I don't know, guy just kind of like doing something with like a barbell or something. And then this like Swedish underwear model of a man walks over to him. And I was like, what's happening? And so like I paused my music. And the Swedish guy says something in Swedish. And then the guy was like really embarrassed. And he's like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, I don't speak Swedish, but were you using this? And he was like apologizing. And he felt really like, I felt for him. Like he felt really like nervous. And the Swedish guy in this very calm voice was just like, no, I'm sorry for assuming that you spoke Swedish. I just wanted to let you know that when you lift like that, if you don't arch your back or whatever he said, you can actually kind of pull a muscle. And so it's better if you have this position. And then the guy was like, thank you. And then the underwear model guy was like, you know, like, we're going to work out right here. Do you want us to work out with us? And then the three of them worked out together. And I was like, what? Like, is this the same country I'm in?
I'm super shocked to hear this.
And I've had like, that was the first. And I just had over and over and over again, more and more interactions like that. And when I talk to friends here in Gothenburg and like we compare it to Stockholm, one thing that I commonly hear is that like, Gothenburg like is a big city, but it's not, and like a lot of people here like don't think of themselves as being in a big city, so they still have this kind of like small town mentality. And Stockholm to me it's very much like New York. Like in New York, or in the U.S., essentially, like if you want to like quote unquote make it, you move to L.A. or you move to New York. And so like there's like this joke that you graduate from college and then you defect to New York and like you live there.
I'm from New York.
So this is what I'll say about this. I lived in New York for a year. My dad's from New York. Everyone that I know who was like born and raised in New York are like the most open-minded, beautiful, just friendly, helpful people on the planet. And very often people I met who moved to New York to quote unquote make it are like cutthroat. They don't want to be your friend. They're always competing with. And I had a lot of that experience in Stockholm, where it was a lot of competition and a lot of like, well, I work here, well, I do that, and I don't see that in Gothenburg at all, and it's much more laid back. And again, these are generalizations. I am not at all saying that like this is how it is for everybody. I'm just speaking from my own personal experience and observations of the two cities.
Being from New York, I appreciate it. But do you see it play out in terms of the workplace and kind of like, I find in Stockholm, it's really like networking, you know. But do you see a sort of like a lighter side to all of this? Or,
well,
yeah, I'm not really sure. Actually, I'm super sorry. It's very open-ended. Question,
no, I know what you mean. I think that like a lot of like the social circles that I was in Stockholm felt very like networky, like what do you do? This is what I do. And the social circles I have here in Gothenburg are like the opposite of that. It's completely different. In terms of workplace specific, I haven't really noticed a big difference. Like in Stockholm, I worked in places on Södermalm and like one place in Norrmalm. And in all of the places I worked, it was very, very friendly, goofy, happy. Like the work culture was essentially the same, but it's the social life that's dramatically different in my experience.
Cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's move to another question. We have Degmo.
This is the name I recognize, I think.
Oh. Oh.
Oh.
Oh wait, I think she came back. 1 second. Okay, you're in.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, Abel.
Hello.
Thank you both for such an amazing talk. This has been so inspiring and eye-awakening. And yeah, lovely to hear all the history on Jantelagen. For someone who's raised in Sweden, I had no idea.
That's what I keep on finding. There's so many Swedes are like, but where did it come from? I'm like, it's a freaking book from Denmark. It was supposed to be a critique.
Mind-blowing, no idea. You just know about the concept, and it's quite like contradicted because you're taught from a societal perspective what Jantelagen is and how you're supposed to act, but then you go to university and business school and all that, and it's complete opposite.
Yeah.
And you get confused. You're like, okay, who am I supposed to be?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I just wanted to ask you, so on the topic of workplace culture, I see there's a lot of, pressure on the employee to fit in the, company or the Swedish culture.
Yeah.
But at the other hand, we live in a world super globalized, and, companies and brands are expanding, hiring from other countries, opening up offices. And I found that there's a huge discrepancy in the responsibilities from the company side to actually adapt and understand cultures of their employees, because they've actually chosen to hire internationally. Yeah. So how do you navigate that world of course, taking your own responsibility as an employee, but also, putting that quote unquote pressure on your employer to understand, origins and social context and so on. Do you have any experience, advice on how to tackle that situation?
So yeah, I do have experiences. I think I mentioned a story about an old colleague of mine who moved to Sweden, and back in his home country, he was a total rock star, and then he came to our company, and people were kind of like, "What's happening?"
Yeah.
And in that situation, I got involved, and I was just explaining that there's clearly a misunderstanding of what the expectations are and how to talk about that.
Yeah.
And so they were able to turn it around. I think processes for specifically performance evaluations and processes for management techniques and codes of conduct for a company in Sweden that's going to be actively bringing in international people, a company that like says our working language is English, like that to me is like if a Swedish company says that, then their code of conduct and their whole processes of everything needs to be super spelled out for everybody involved. So like if they want to do it in a very Swedish way, they need to spell out the Swedish way very explicitly.
Yeah.
Like we had one situation where we did like a DEI survey, and we found out that of all the different kind of demographics within the company, the non-Swedish employees were having the most different experience.
Yeah.
So then after that, we did interviews, and we found out that like one of the things was so simple. It was that a lot of the international employees were like disappointed by the benefits and like what the company could offer. And then when we started to talk, we realized that everything that they were missing was actually something that the government provides, but they were expecting the company to provide it. So we had to go through and rewrite all of the documentation, like in our intranet, that explained how benefits and everything works.
Yeah.
So yeah, in summary, I think the codes of conduct and processes need to be specifically written for explaining the Swedish system if you're going to be very Swedish. And if you're not, I really like doing like cross-cultural training. So like there's a company called BBI that's really, really wonderful. And they did a training for everyone in the entire company where they just went through these broad generalizations of like different expectations of management, different expectations of like social discussion.
Yeah.
And so everyone got to learn about all the cultures in one go, which was really, really wonderful.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Because I can just recall like a situation where I was working with this client, and they were an international company, and one of their like tasks, or the task that I was about to help them with was, okay, teach the Swedish culture. And I asked them, but what is the Swedish culture?
Yeah.
What is the Swedish culture? Is it jantelagen?
Yeah.
And I had to sort of reshape the whole conversation and ask them, so what parts, like how do you want, is it the way you talk, the way you ask questions, like the behaviors, and then like literally write down each behavior and give examples, because they were like, that's Swedish culture, and I'm like, but Swedish culture is not a universal thing.
And it's also not uniform. Like it's like different generations, different parts of the country. Like
exactly.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, now Gothenburg and Stockholm, that's a huge difference.
Yeah.
So I wanted to give a tip. I read this book by Erin Meyers. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's called The Culture Map. And she identifies 8 different problem areas. And one of them is feedback. And it's super interesting to read about her thoughts and processes around that. So just a little...
I know what you're talking
love it.
about.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really, really nice.
So awesome. Well, I'm going to jump out. Thank you so much. And I hope to catch you soon, Abel.
Yeah. Maybe see you in Oslo again.
Yes. 100%. Thank you. Thanks.
Now, do we have time for one more question, or should we go out? Are you ready to call it a day? Does anyone else want to ask a question? I think we have time for one more. We can squeeze in. Last call. I know we saw someone that was in the box that jumped out, but yeah. We have Anna.
Yeah, hi. I don't have a question. I just wanted to say huge thanks. It was a fascinating session, very insightful, and I can totally relate to some of the things you mentioned. I'm originally Russian. I worked with a Swedish manager. I mean, what can I say? It was a challenge. But yeah, thank you so much. I learned so much today, and please keep going with this session, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I love doing these audio events, and just to give everyone like a really quick idea of like how I even started doing this, I will have private meetings with like, let's say me and Abel, I think we've met like 2 or 3 times by now already, right? And we've had a lot of, I mean, this stuff that we're talking about now, this is the stuff that we talk about privately, like in our like one-on-one meetings. And I started thinking everyone should hear this stuff. Like we should record this or just have like a public conversation so that the knowledge is, so everyone can have this knowledge, because I will learn new things from you or other people. I mean, this is how I create the content that I do, is just by researching, learning, gathering. And I think everyone should kind of cross share all of this information. So thank you everyone for, I'm seeing some heart emojis and everything. But I mean, I'm so glad that you were here, Abel, with us to share. I mean, I'm learning new things all the time, and I learned a lot from this session with you. So thank you so much for coming on here, talking with us, answering our questions, teaching us. You guys can definitely like go to his profile and follow him, connect with him. He's been sharing content as well. And you also work as a consultant as well, don't you? Correct?
Yeah, I really get so much personal. Like, I used to have a lot of gray hair in my beard, and since I started doing this, it's literally turning back to brown from gray. I really love working with company culture. I find it just pulls on everything that I've experienced in my life. So, yeah.
Yeah, so if anybody is listening here and you work on the organizational side, definitely reach out to Abel for consultations regarding if you need to create a stronger company culture, creating social sustainability, you work in policy and instruction writing, things like that. So anything that is somewhere in that realm of HR, or if you just want to learn from the international professional side, he's posting similar content, kind of like how I am, but more on the Swedenologist side, I guess you could say. And who knows what you're going to start posting on soon. So yeah, everyone listening, you're welcome to reach out to either one of us. There's more information in the details section of the event. So if you want to find the website or some of the things that I've mentioned, just send me a DM, or go to the website, intertalentsinSweden.com. And I think that's it. I think we're done for the evening. Is there anything you want to add?
No, this has been tremendous. This is my first time really just kind of letting my brain open. I've had all of these insights just kind of sitting inside, and I've been boring all of my Swedish friends by grilling them at bars and over dinners about how these things work. So it was really wonderful to be able to see other international people and other Swedes learning about Sweden just from me being a culture nerd.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you ever want to do another event, just reach out. We'll set it up.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, everyone, have a great evening, and feel free to send us any feedback if you enjoyed the event. We love to hear it. Okay. Everyone, have a good night. I'm seeing a lot of hearts. Thanks, guys.